Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we are live. Please let me know if you can hear me clearly, if all the audio is correct. We wouldn't want any technical difficulties during our exciting live stream today. I see hi everyone. I see Villa in chat. I see Ibrahim. Damon says it's working. That's wonderful news. Good to know. Thank you for joining us on this, not usual time. Normally we will be streaming a little later, but still glad that everyone is here. You seem a bit bright though. Yeah, that could be the case. The sun is shining straight through the window. Let's see. Okay, I believe everything's working. So then, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the live stream. It is great to have you all here. As always, make sure to follow us on our social media like Instagram and Twitter, or X as it's also known as, but no one likes to call it as X. If you really want to support us, Patreon is in the description. And many people don't know, but we also have a Discord. So if you want to discuss anything EU, want to debate about the topics, please make sure to join that as well. So today, what I have for you guys in store is a very exciting guest. Today we have Peter Stano, and he will correct me if the pronunciation is supposed to be different. But he is the EU spokesman for foreign policy, so very knowledgeable about everything that is to do with the EU. And especially to the outside world. But next to that, also part security policy. Let's see. Some people are asking, "Are you on Mastodon?" No, we are not, unfortunately. But without further ado, I would like to welcome Peter Stano. Peter, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, bonjour, guten Tag. I have to use all the working languages that we are using in the European Union. It's great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for having me here. I'm ready to tackle all the questions related to EU's foreign policy.
The pleasure is all mine. I'm just going to look at the chat real quick to see if the audio is working for you as well, so that we know that everyone can hear you too, which I believe everyone can. So in the meantime, Peter, I would like to, first of all, ask you, can you introduce yourself? Who are you? What is your work? Just a quick introduction. I think everyone is very curious.
Okay, you introduced me correctly. My name is Peter Stano, or if you want, Peter Stano, because I'm originally Slovak, but I don't mind the English version of the pronunciation of my name. And I'm the spokesperson of the European Union for foreign policy, which includes also security and defense policy. So this means my role is to explain to the media, who then explain to the audiences at home, to people like you, to explain to the media why the EU is doing stuff in relations to other countries outside of the EU. What are we doing? What are our positions, our actions? What do we think about developments around the world? And what are we doing in order to protect the interests of the EU outside of the EU?
Okay, very cool. Extremely interesting. But before we dive into the, let's say, topics of today, the breaking news, I'm very curious how your office actually works, because I think many, including myself, might be a little bit confused, because I believe that most foreign policy lay with the EU member states themselves, and not necessarily with the EU. So could you maybe explain a bit what the exact tasks are of your office, and maybe a bit more about that, let's say, mismatching my own information?
Absolutely, and with pleasure, because I understand that it might be difficult for people just simply to imagine how it works, exactly because, as you said, foreign policy, defense policy, and security policies, these are policies which are so-called national competence. That means that all the decisions in these three areas are being made by member states in unanimity. Unanimity means that everyone has to agree. No one can be against. But of course, we have 27 member states, and soon probably more. And all this needs to be coordinated, prepared, facilitated. And this is the role of EU foreign policy, which is headed by the EU High Representative for foreign policy and security policy. Currently is Josep Borrell, but you know that the mandate of the current institutions will expire in a few months. But still, regardless of the name, the role of the High Representative is to coordinate, strengthen, and move ahead or advance the foreign policy of the European Union, so that we are able, as a community of relatively many member states, very diverse, so that we are able to act and speak with one voice when it comes to international stage, so that we are able to react fast, to say something what we think about events around us, but also to act fast, so that we can, let's say, protect the European Union, protect the European citizens, contribute to the solutions of various crises in our neighborhood, which are destabilizing us as well. So it's a role of the hub, coordinator, facilitator, and the one who tries to find the consensus among the member states, because 27, like, I don't know how many people are now connected, but if we start to discuss one topic, we will have 27 different views, or 30 different views, or 100 different views, and to find the common ground is very difficult. But this is how the EU works. We find the consensus because together we are stronger, and if we agree on something, on a solution, then the solution is powerful and sustainable because it's backed by 27 member states. And this goes not only for the foreign policy, but of course I can speak only about foreign policy because this is where I have the best insight, and this is what I try to explain to media from all over the world, who are more and more interested what the EU thinks and what the EU does about various problems on this beautiful planet.
Beautiful planet. Well, it's so if I'm hearing it correctly, it's not only looking outside of the European Union, but it's also a lot of getting every single member state to point their proverbial noses towards the same direction. So a lot of coordination and speaking with the member states as well, which I can imagine is not an easy task. I can imagine.
It's not easy, but again, I mean, it's 27 very different member states. And if you look at the map of the European Union, we have countries as different as Portugal on the westernmost end of the EU, and Estonia at the eastern and northernmost end of the EU, and then the Scandinavian countries. Each of them have different history, different links with neighbors, different experiences, different social fabric, so different mentality. And it's already a miracle that we manage actually not only to be together, to live together, but work efficiently together in so many areas, including the foreign and defense policy. And nowhere else is this seen better than on the case of Ukraine, the biggest security challenge and threat for the EU. And yet we managed to be unified and united right from the start in our response to this aggression. And that goes for many other things. So yeah, it's difficult, it's complicated, but it works. And this is the only way how the EU can work.
Yeah, I want to get into topics like Ukraine in just a moment, because that is obviously very pressing and a very big topic, especially for many Europeans today. Let me turn to the chat real quick because I see a few questions already. So thank you for those. Once again, if you want your question answered 100%, please make sure to use the super chat function. So not only your chat will be answered, but also you can support our channel and the work that we do. So Damon asks, earlier today, the EU didn't come to an agreement with Chinese car manufacturers. What could happen now since there was no deal? And this is already moving towards the, let's say, substance of what we're going to be talking about. But maybe you have a thought or something to say about that, Peter.
The issue of electric cars and our economic relations with China are not really part of the foreign policy, so this is not my competence. But in general, the approach of the EU to any issues we have with our partners, and China is still a partner of the European Union, trading partner, economic partner, but also political partner, because we work with China closely, for example, on climate change. So the general approach of the EU is engagement. Because the EU believes in win-win solutions. We don't impose things, we protect our interests, but we also take into account the interests of others. And we try to discuss. So the same thing as I explained before, how we arrive to compromises within the EU, we try to apply also in interactions with partners. So if we have a grievance with China, with US, with African countries, with anyone, we try to engage in a dialogue to see how we can settle the issue so that both of us profit. Because in the end, if we profit, our citizens profit from it. And if the Chinese profit, in this case, their citizens profit. So everyone is happy. So we don't really see by default confrontation as the way forward. We always try to engage. And if we see that the partner is not ready, then of course, then we take the necessary measures, legal measures, which are, justified in our legal framework. Then we take the necessary measures to protect ourselves, to stick to the laws, to stick to the rules. But again, we start from the premise of finding solution agreeable for everyone, beneficial for everyone. And this is what we are trying to advance also in the case of the electric cars and the issues we have in China in this specific trade issue.
Okay. So thank you for all your questions, guys. They're all very interesting. But I want to ask one more question as a sort of introductory question before we move on. Could you explain very shortly how you already mentioned Borrell, which is, I believe, going to be replaced by Kaja Kallas in a few months. How is that high representative related to your office, to your team? Is that could we say that it's the boss, or is that the highest representative? Could you say a little bit about that?
I will reveal a few details from our internal cuisine. So, of course, among us within our team, we refer to HRVP as the boss. But in Brussels, in the setup of the European institutions, everything is a little bit more complicated. So the full title of Josep Borrell, or in few months, Kaja Kallas, is HRVP. High Representative / Vice President. High Representative goes for the foreign policy, High Representative of the EU foreign policy, which means on behalf of EU member states. At the same time, it's Vice President of the Commission. So it's double-headed position. So he sits in the European Commission, but also in the European External Action Service, which is the specialized service, if you want, the diplomatic arm of the European Union, which serves the member states in the field of foreign policy. Our team, as a press team for the foreign policy, is sitting in the European Commission. In the structure, we belong to the European Commission, to the Directorate General for Communications, but paradoxically, we speak on behalf of the High Representative Borrell. That means on behalf of the EU foreign policy, which is agreed by the member state. So it's a little bit specific. And for the nerds of European integration and European policies, it might be very exciting and very interesting to get more insights about this. For people outside, it doesn't really make sense, because what we say on behalf of the EU foreign policy, which is represented by Borrell, or then by Kallas, and formed, decided, adopted by the member states. So it's relatively easy, but of course, he is not part of our team. High Representative is not sitting in our offices. We are physically also in different places, but our role is to explain what he does on behalf of the EU.
Okay, thank you. Of course, it's the EU, so it can't be just straightforward and easy. That wouldn't make it fun. Otherwise, thank you for your comment, Vieten. Hello, Peter. Hello, Elliot. Thank you for your work in making the EU more comprehensive to its citizens. Just a nice comment. So moving on to the, let's say, more substance, because that's why everyone's here. I think it would be interesting to take the different parts of the world that the EU interacts with, so let's say the different continents, and then go from the current topics from continents. So let's say we begin with Europe, but the non-European countries. Could you maybe say a little bit about what the main tasks include when it comes to interacting with non-European not, let's say, European non-EU members? And what do we think about here? Is this like security cooperation, sanctions? Of course, Ukraine is in that same basket, but Belarus and Russia as well, Georgia, all of these countries. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yes, as you said, Elliot, previously, it's a lot of fun here. And even in your question, I can reveal that there is also a lot of fun, because non-EU members in Europe actually have two levels: those who don't want to be in the EU and those who want to be in the EU. So we have countries like Norway, UK, Switzerland, which are countries very closely linked to the European Union, but they are not members. But they are working with us on many issues. We have specific agreements with them. For example, Switzerland is part of Schengen, Norway, I think, as well. Norway actually is taking over almost 90% of the European legislation. So they are aligned with the European Union to very, very high extent. And then we have countries in Europe who want to join the European Union. These are what we call accession countries in the Western Balkans. So countries like Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Kosovo, and countries in our eastern neighborhood, countries like Ukraine, also candidate country of the EU, because Ukraine wants to join the EU and is in the process of negotiating the entry, Moldova and Georgia. And then we have Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus. Of course, with Belarus, we have almost no contacts, because there is a dictatorship which stole elections from people 4 years ago, which is participating in the illegal aggression by Russia against Ukraine. So, of course, our contacts there and our aims there are very limited, and the only aim is to basically have Lukashenko step down and have democratic transition in the country. But we know that this is not going to happen anytime soon, but hopefully the Belarusians will be able to achieve it at one point, and we are supporting them. But we are not organization involved in regime change, so that's why we are supporting people, but we are not going in changing the regimes. This is, not what we do. In case of Azerbaijan, of course, I mean, again, different model of governing the society, but we have a lot of economic cooperation. We are bound by the cooperation partnership agreement, where we are developing mutually beneficial contacts and ties in an extent that corresponds to the ambitions of the partner. They don't want to have much with the EU, so we don't do much. Armenia, on the contrary, wants to get as close to the EU as possible, to develop the cooperation as much as possible. So we then respond to them based on the level of their ambition, and we develop closer cooperation. So, and our main aim is to share the EU experience and the best things about the EU. And that means stability and prosperity for the citizens, so that people can live decent lives in secure and stable environment.
So is this only messaging that that your office does, or does your office also assist in the countries that are in accession talks, like Moldova, Ukraine, or is that more towards I believe there's also an enlargement commission, right? So are you also partly responsible for that, or is there a clear split between those two?
Maybe a little clarification on the terminology. When we say our office means the press office of the High Representative or the press office for the foreign policy. So we explain the policies. Those who actually do the policies are our colleagues, the so-called bureaucrats, if you want, officials, experts, diplomats in different, we call them services of the European Commission or of the European Union. In case of foreign policy, it's the External Action Service of the EU called EAS. In case of Commission, there are directorates general. These are like ministries, for example. And exactly as you remarked, the enlargement and also the neighborhood policies are advanced first of all through Directorate General for Enlargement and Neighborhood Policy. It's called abbreviated DG NEAR. They have all the money, they have all the expertise, and they are doing the everyday work to help the partner countries, for example, to conduct the necessary reforms to get closer to the European standards, or to take over the European legislation, depending on the level of how close they want to be with us, to support them with financial assistance. So this is the role of the DG NEAR. So the technical work on bringing the European standards to that country. And then the EAS, as so-called foreign ministry of the EU, we oversee the more political factors, let's say the security factors, the overall cooperation, as you remarked, the alignment with European sanctions, because countries who are applying to join the European Union have already now the obligation to adopt the sanctions decisions we are taking against other countries or against other entities around the world. They need to, we call it, align with EU foreign policy. So the EAS is overseeing this and is giving more political oversight on what the colleagues from individual specialized DGs are doing on the ground, let's say on a more technical level in the accession process, or in bringing the agreements we have with the neighboring countries closer to the European standards and closer to the delivery of the results. Because in the end, what we want to see at the end of all these efforts working with those countries is practical benefits for the citizens. So they see their countries reformed, their economies running, the level of investment from the EU rising, exchanges between us, not only trade exchanges of students, people-to-people contacts, growing and bringing us together, because this is the soft power of the EU. We are exporting a model of principles and values, and we do it through this, I think, way which is really beneficial for everyone.
To those values, we will return shortly. First, I want to ask a few questions, because some people in the chat are wondering some questions, country-specific questions. Excuse me. Villa, thank you for being a patron. He asks, what is the EU's official stance on what is happening in Georgia right now, which I believe that they are referring to the new Russia law as it has been introduced, and the effects of such. And are there any aspirations for Georgia accession to the EU, or has that been abandoned as a realistic objective? We had just established that this is more for DG NEAR, but perhaps you have a view on that as well.
Of course, Georgia is a very sad story, unfortunately. Not Georgia as a country, but the actions of the current government.
Yes.
Because on one hand, last year they submitted the application to join the European Union, but in practice, and they declared that their strategic objective is to join the European Union. But what they do in practice is not really to come closer to the EU, but they are taking the country away from the European track, away from the European values. And it's not only the latest law, which is so-called protection of the family law, which is really a law against LGBTI.
Yep.
But earlier this year, they adopted another Russian-inspired law, so-called law on the transparency of the foreign funding or foreign influence. And all these laws, although they are branded as something that sounds quite legitimate and good because every country needs to protect itself, in the essence, these laws are against the principles and values of a democratic society. They are against the European standards and principles for 2 or 3 reasons. One is that usually they are adopted in a procedure which is either rushed, not completed, and without public consultations, like the case of the latest batch of the legislation last week on the so-called family protection, or like in case of the law on the foreign on transparency law on the foreign funding, completely against the advice of everyone, the European Union, the United States, the Venice Commission. Venice Commission is an independent body which is a benchmark for all the legislative steps in Europe. And now when everyone says the law is not really good and it goes against the basic principles, and yet they adopted it. The president was against it. The big majority of the population was against it. The Georgian government promised last year, after massive protests, that they will not bring this law on the table. Yet they did it in spring this year again.
Yep.
So they lied. And they are introducing something which is against the advice of every friend of Georgia from wide and far. So this is taking the country away from the European ambition, because for European process to start, we identified 9 priorities. So before that, they had like certain priorities, and with one law, they are violating already 3 of these priorities or not delivering on them. So it's very difficult. It's a sad story. We don't abandon Georgia and Georgian people. We know that 80% of Georgian people want to go closer to the Europe, but the current government, despite what they proclaim, indeed is taking the country, unfortunately, away from Europe. And the big decision moment will be the October elections.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. There's going to be very important elections in October, because essentially, if 80% want to pursue more closer ties to the European Union, and their government seems to be taking them away from it, in an ideal world, you would hope that then the government would change. So we will see in the elections, but definitely something to keep your eye out on. Before we move to Ukraine, which I believe is probably one of the largest topics within Europe right now, I wanted to ask a question from one of our viewers called Damon. He asks, UK citizens have polled roughly 60% for rejoining the EU. Do you think there could be any time within the next decade or two of the UK rejoining? And what would the UK need to agree to rejoin? This is the eternal question. Can and will the UK rejoin the EU? I guess, yeah. Do you have an answer? Of course, no.
Certainly not in the next 2 or 3 months, when the current institutions will be still in place. So our mandate is to talk on behalf of the EU until the end of this mandate. This will expire in November or December. So for sure, in these next few months, it will not be on the table. So anything beyond that, I can give you only my personal view, which is not really relevant. But again, joining the EU is a process where the population of a country in question needs to agree. And we have seen the referendum a few years ago about the Brexit.
Yep.
If Britain organizes another referendum and the overwhelming majority of people says, yes, we want to join the EU, then okay, it will be a nice signal. It will be for the remaining, for the members of the European Union to decide, because accession is actually also something all 27 member states of the EU have to agree with.
Yep.
And after the very, very traumatic experience with the post-Brexit negotiations, behavior, and everything that was happening in the relations between the EU and UK, I'm not really sure the member states are really inclined to go through this in a reverse mode again. But again, things are changing very fast in the world today. We in the EU believe that together we are stronger. So we have the integration in our DNA, in our blood. So of course we think that we will be stronger if we have more members. But again, every member potential member has specific circumstances. But again, here the most important thing is the will of the population, the voters in the country in question, and then the willingness of the EU to receive such a country.
The members, that's always the biggest part, is we will never be sure if people want the UK back in the first place, but we'll see. So then moving on, I believe that many in Europe see Russia, or maybe saw, as their biggest threat, especially after the Russian invasion into Ukraine. And I was wondering what your it's difficult for me to ask, let's say, experience, or does your office have anything to do, have any task within the current sanctions on Russia, within the current talks with countries surrounding Russia, anything to do with Russia, basically?
Yes, of course. I mean, Russia launched illegal aggression against Ukraine. With this, Russia violated UN Charter, international law, its own commitments. Russia violated its own commitments. And Russia has shown to everyone in the world that they don't hesitate to use military force when they try to advance their interests and recreate some kind of neo-imperialistic sphere of influence, as Putin is dreaming. But what Russia is doing, they are not only militarily attacking Ukraine, they are also leading an information war against Ukraine, of course, but against the European Union as well, against the United States, against everyone who does not agree with their illegal behavior. And of course, it affects us, and we are fighting back. So in our case, our team, for example, we people involved in communication, we have to deal every day with debunking the Russian lies, the Russian information manipulation, the Russian disinformations. Push back on the
sorry to interrupt you. I think this is a very interesting topic, because I believe this has been going on, this hybrid warfare, so to speak, has been going on for quite many years. But have you seen an uptick, or has there been an increase in this activity ever since the war in Ukraine?
Of course. I mean, Russia was using information manipulation since many years already, but in the EU collectively, we started to perceive it, and we realized that they are using it against us in 2014 when they attacked Ukraine for the first time, when they illegally annexed Crimea and started the terrorist separatist war in the east of Ukraine. And then we realized, this is not a military operation only, it's accompanied by a massive disinformation campaign directed also against us, against individual member states of the EU. And then since then, of course, there were ups and downs. Of course, Corona crisis marked a very different category of disinformation, when all the Russian disinformation actors focused on disinformation activities related to Corona and trying to undermine the EU from within through disinformation related to Corona. But then shortly before the aggression against Ukraine started in February 2 years ago, we've seen already the preparations. So they were preparing ground as of December, January. It was so obvious that they are preparing the ground. And then, of course, it massively went up. And since then, it's doubling, it's tripling, because it's really a massive onslaught of disinformation accompanying the military activities and accompanying every development on the field. With various disinformation campaigns, various narratives. We can go into it in detail if you want. But yes, in short, there was an uptick, and it continues because they are using it as another way of attacking Ukraine and the EU.
Yeah, and I believe it is, well, in my personal opinion, sometimes rather effective as well. But yeah, this is obviously not the disinfo, even though it's an incredibly interesting topic. I would like to move on to other parts of the world. So we've covered non-EU European countries, but let's move on to probably another very, very difficult topic, at least for myself, because many emotions go paired with it, and you probably can already guess it. If we're moving more towards the Middle East, the current war conflict between Israel and Palestine, right? And there's many people in the chat that have been quite vocal already, asking, let's say, thought-provoking questions like, is supporting genocide also our values as the European Union? So they're very outspoken. So could you give us the current stance of the European Union on the current conflict in Gaza?
Absolutely, and I absolutely agree. I mean, this is an issue that stimulates a lot of emotions because we see human suffering on a scale unseen until now. I mean, okay, we've seen the massacres going on in Syria, we've seen also the stuff what is going on in Ukraine, but what happens in Gaza is really something concentrated on a very small territory from which the people have actually no escape. And this is the tragic about it. And yes, we are very much aware about all the criticism against the European Union when it comes to this conflict. But again, politically, I have to recall the official positions of the European Union as agreed by the European leaders. We said very clearly three main things. We totally rejected and condemned the terrorist attacks by Hamas, who actually triggered this. Hamas knew what Israeli response would be. So we strongly condemned the terrorist attacks from 7th of October last year. We said Israel has right to defend itself because Israel was attacked and was under attack. And by the way, until today, there are rockets flying against Israel. So Israel continues to be under attack. But then we said, of course, we need to be very careful when it comes to the proportionality of the response. And that's why we said Israel has the right to defend itself in line with the international law. And you see that there are more and more cases where it's really difficult to see if the international law is being respected. One thing is that there is no access to Gaza. Barely no one has, almost no one has access to Gaza. So that's problem number one. Problem number two, way too many people have been killed, maimed, injured, traumatized, their futures destroyed, and they are without the necessary means to survive. Polio broke out in Gaza after 20 years. So it's heartbreaking. From a human level, it's heartbreaking. From political level, we still have two parties continuing the fight. As long as there are two parties still fighting, the war will be going on, and people will be suffering. EU's position is very clear. You can, of course, ask legitimately. So why does the EU don't stop the war? Doesn't stop the war? Well, do we have means? We try. Through diplomatic means, we try. But Israel has partners who are holding his back very strongly, and they listen only to them, sometimes not even to them, and that's the United States. So we try to pressure Israel, we try to pressure the Palestinian side. We don't pressure Hamas because we don't have official contacts with Hamas, but we are pressuring the partners of Hamas, countries like Qatar, Iran, to make sure to them that they are responsible for this wide-scale suffering. It's a very emotional issue. It's a very divisive issue. The credibility of the EU went down, especially in the Arab world, because of the perceived double standards or inability to act. But I would like to ask everyone, try to believe that, at least from the European level, we are really, or the politicians, the diplomats are trying to do whatever they can. But in order to stop the war, you need to have the two parties being willing to stop the war. And they are not. Neither Hamas nor Israel at this stage, and other actors involved like Hezbollah, Iran, and the Houthis in Yemen.
I think that's a very good point, and I can't imagine it must be easy, especially when within the European Union, the member states also have different opinions on the conflict themselves. So it must be almost near to impossible to get one aligned view out on this conflict as well.
True, but again, the basic position of the EU was agreed by 27 member states. So we insist on these 3 points: the right to self-defense, hostages needs to be released, humanitarian access needs to be granted, Israel needs to act in line with the international law. Where we don't agree is in how far should we go to make sure that Israel really sticks to respecting the international law, and how to ensure the accountability for any possible violations of the international law. And there is the unanimity of the member states, which in case of Israel is not there, unfortunately.
Yeah. So, Peter, from one divisive topic, let's go to the next, because there's no lack of divisive topics within everything surrounding the European Union. Wayam Ibrahim too says, or asks, what is the EU's stance towards Taliban and Assad regimes now that anti-immigrant sentiment and calls for deportation are rising? So from Israel and Palestine to immigration, of course, a very large subject right now. What are your thoughts on that?
It's 3 very relevant and important issues. I would say not really related, because the level of our engagement or lack of engagement with someone or something, in case of Taliban, does not really influence our migration policies, because migration policies are mostly about who do we allow into the EU territory under what conditions. But with Taliban, we don't recognize Taliban. They took over militarily the power in Afghanistan, so they are not elected. They don't have legitimacy in our eyes. But They are in power, so we consider them as de facto authorities, and we have the necessary contacts with them in order to be able to help the Afghan people. We cannot cut the contacts. We are actually on the ground. The EU delegation is the only Western embassy present in Afghanistan, and thanks to our presence on the ground, we are able to continue helping Afghan women, for example, to get education, to get the humanitarian assistance to people who need it. But we need to be realistic. Cutting ourselves off from someone will not allow us to achieve anything, and then we will be just watching from the seat behind. So we prefer to be on the ground, engage, and conveying them also our displeasure with what they do. And we are there, they tolerate us, and we are able to achieve small things for the people. Of course, you could say, and there could be big discussions about in how far should we stand up for the values, but this is what we believe is the most effective way if you want to help the people. Same in Syria. I mean, we don't recognize the legitimacy of Assad regime, but you see that the Assad regime is being rehabilitated by the Arab world. And now they are conducting almost business as usual. For us, no, it's a principled position. He has no legitimacy. There needs to be accountability for all the crimes committed against the Syrian people. But again, this does not prevent us from interactions with the regime at the lower level. So there are lower level contacts in order to deliver our messages, to try to engage them, to make sure that they deliver on their commitments in the UN-led process to solve the Syrian crisis, or to deliver assistance to people, because UN agencies are on the ground. They are helping the displaced people, internally displaced people, poor people, etc., etc. So in order to be able also to work with the UN, we need to have access, we need to have contacts. And again, the EU delegation is one of the few embassies of the EU member states who are still present on the ground. So, and through these, we are able to achieve things, small things. Of course, we will not change the overall situation, but again, we are not interventionists. The change of the situation has to come from within. And the migration, I mean, you refer probably to the recent decision in Germany to send back certain unsuccessful asylum seekers back to countries like Syria or Afghanistan. Again, each case is different. So these cases need to be handled and evaluated individually. And of course, we don't want to have people who commit crimes in the EU. We should be able to decide who do we allow to our territory. And this is the competence of our member states. So the member states need to make this choice, this assessment individually. They cannot expose vulnerable people to possible risks in this regime. So if you send an opposition activist from Europe to Syria, you can be sure that they will be killed or tortured. So you don't do it. But after individually evaluating each case, the countries have the right and competence to decide whether they will repatriate someone or not.
All right.
And it doesn't have to be to that country. It can be in the direction of that country.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Let us move on. There's infinitely more topics to cover, so we can't do that. And I try to be conservative with our time. So let us move on to of course, the next big thing is, I believe many people are looking towards November, to the United States, the elections that are going to be happening there soon. Of course, Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. I was really wondering, has as a foreign policy, has there any scenarios been made? Has there any discussions been had on what kind of impact both presidents could have on the European Union? How will one candidate affect the European Union over the other? Can you say a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. Our approach by default is we seek engagement. I mentioned that before. This is like we always, and especially in case of countries that are probably our closest ally. The United States are the most like-minded partner we have around the world because of the shared history, the language, the principles, the values. We are all based on democratic principles, and traditionally the transatlantic link. So this is how we call the relations between EU and the US, like this transatlantic partnership was always the cornerstone of our security and stability. I would dare to say that it's also a cornerstone of the global stability and security, because together with the United States, we are the most powerful. We have the most powerful militaries because we are bound also in the NATO. It's nothing related to the EU, but like 2/3 of our members are also members of the NATO. So militarily, we are the biggest entity and biggest force in the world. Economically, in terms of market, investment, and money, we are the biggest in the world. So we have enormous leverage over the world in order to protect the principles and values we believe in. So I think it's in the interest of the Americans and us to continue working together. But of course, during the first Trump administration, We made specific experience about how unilateral he can be, how ignorant he can be. And of course, we are prepared for any scenario that might come after the elections. But of course, we are not interfering. It's the elections.
No.
It's the choice of American people. And we will adjust ourselves, whatever result there will be.
There will probably be needing some adjustments, but maybe a bit deeper on that. User Hello Hi asks the following. Why should the USA help Europe with Russia in an event that, with further escalation, I imagine that they're referring to, when Europe refuses to help the USA with China? Take that as you will, but can you say a little bit about that?
No, I accept that there might be such perceptions, but we have very intensive dialogue with the US on China.
Yep.
We have exchanges. In many things we agree. We don't agree on certain things because it seems that the US administration chose for some kind of seeing China as a threat, as a challenge, as a threat. We in the EU see China a little bit in a more differentiated way. We see China first as a strategic partner, because without China, we will not solve global problems, such as global warming, Iranian nuclear program. China sits in the UN Security Council as a permanent member, so they can block any international global activity. So we need to work with them on the issues of global interest. But then we are also economic competitors. We are competing for the same markets. We are competing for investment. They are, copying our technologies and try to compete with us in terms of economy.
Only copying, like near stealing. Sometimes you could almost say.
Yeah, I'm official. I have to be diplomatic in my remarks.
Yeah.
We know what we are talking about. But again, it's mutually beneficial that we have this economic relationship, because our investments are helping create China jobs and feed their people. And on the other hand, just look around yourself. Everything you find is made in China, almost everything. So without China, they are producing everything for us. So it's a mutual dependency. We want to de-risk. So we want to create dangerous dependencies like we did with Russia and fossil fuel. So we took the lesson, we learned the lesson, and we are trying to adjust our relationship in this sense. But we are still working together economically, although we are also competing. And then we are strategic rivals or systemic rivals, because our systems are rivaling itself. We are democracy based on human rights and respect for citizens. They are autocracy or dictatorship based on one-party rule. But again, United States sees it differently, but we work together on many issues with the Americans. And why America should help us with Russia? It's not America is helping us. America would be helping Ukraine, and America is helping the global world order, because Russia is a threat for the global system of rules.
Yep.
They are violating international law, big scale. They brought war back on the European continent after 70 or 80 years after the traumatic experience of the Second World War. And they do it in a most brutal fashion, targeting civilians and targeting, civilian infrastructure, disregarding their own commitments, legal commitments, agreement they signed. They are just simply ignoring. So this is not the way to go. And it's in the interest of America not to leave this unanswered, because if Russia gets away, if Putin gets away with this behavior, then there is plenty of other actors around this world who have territorial aspirations at their neighbors, who want to create buffer zones or extend their zones of influence, and are reckless enough to use the force. And all of them are watching how the international community, understand EU and US, because we are the democratic forces in this world, how we will react to this. Because if we don't, then the others will be encouraged in Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, and then we have mayhem in the world.
Yeah, well, personally, I agree. I'm not sure what the current stance of EU made simple is, but I personally, I totally agree with that. I know we have a few more minutes left. We're nearing the end. If you don't mind to stay like 2 or 3 more minutes, because this kind of segues very nicely into another question for everyone that's watching. Thank you. But if you really want your question answered, please make sure to use Super Chat, and then I will ask the question before we go. Anyways, that really is a nice segue towards I'm sure you've heard of it, the Draghi report that came out a few days ago. And I think specifically for your field of expertise, the mentions of de-risking and cutting dependencies, lifting strategic autonomy, all of those topics sound very important. And could you maybe go a little bit more into these and what you and your office takes away from that report, or like what how you are connected to this report, if at all?
Well, the report is a set of very good recommendations that might be taken up and implemented in the new mandate of the new commission. So in this sense, there's not really much for me to comment. I can only say that this is a very useful contribution, because the European Union is a constantly evolving organism. We are a project. I mean, we all are EU. Elliot, you are the EU. Your users, your viewers are the EU. We all are shaping the EU. The EU is not a construct that is imposed on the people. The construct, the Brussels, whatever we do as institutions, needs to reflect the wishes of people or to work for the benefit of the people. So these reports, this, let's say, this feedback, this mirror on how the EU works, where the EU fails, are very important, and it's part of our evolution, because this helps us to adjust where we have shortcomings, where we are maybe just going, out of the routine and we stopped being innovative. And the report from this perspective is very important because it pinpoints areas which are very important. The structure of our industry. How do we invest? How do we do research and innovation? So this is very important. And I think this will fit into the policy making in the next few months and years, because if we want to maintain the standing of the EU as a world class economic power, the biggest single market in the world, the highest performing economy in the world, then we need to go hand in hand with the developments in the world nowadays. So this will be for our successors. So that's why for me it's great to see that there are people who care, and I only hope that this will be really taken very seriously and implemented. And the political guidelines of the new commission are already focused on the areas which are identified in this Draghi report. So I think this is very good. It can only contribute to EU becoming even better for its citizens, because in the end, this is what the EU is all about, to deliver for the citizens, so that we really can make sure that this project stays what it was about when it was founded. It was about peace, stability, and prosperity for the people, not for the elites, but for the people.
Okay, Peter, I want to thank you very much about talking with us, basically, about all of these very interesting topics. I believe we could sit here for another 2 hours and go through every single continent, country, position. But of course, we don't have the time, unfortunately. So everyone, I want to thank you for watching. Peter, do you have anything last words? Anything you would maybe plug or something you want to share with the crowd before we sign off? Please do so.
Thank you very much. Just very big thanks for your time and the questions you made and all the comments you made also in the chat. This is very important for us, for the EU, to have the feedback, because I keep repeating, this is a project for the citizens, and it's up to each of us to contribute to shaping this project. This might sound kitschy, but actually, if you think about it, you can co-shape it by your public engagement, by talking to people, by trying to find more about what the EU does, how the EU does it, and interact with your elected representatives who are there, then participating in the decision-making in Brussels. So this is my plea for everyone. Just take keen interest in the EU. Don't perceive and don't allow the EU to be portrayed as something remote, because EU is us. EU is what we live every day in our countries. This is about member states, about people in the member states. And it's good that you cared, because you joined this debate. And for this, I thank you really very much.
Absolutely. So that's right, dear viewers. A big shout out to you guys as well. So if that's all, once again, thank you for watching, and I would love to see you guys on the next live stream. Have a good afternoon, evening, morning, depending on where you are, and goodbye.
Bye-bye.